Good morning, everybody. Welcome into this week's long-form episode on Mining Stock Daily, our last episode before PDAC 2025. Look forward to seeing as many of you up there in Toronto over the next few days, and do stay warm. But we are going to wrap up this week with a special guest, Mr. Brent Johnson from Santiago Capital. And there's a lot to discuss here, including the sustainability or unsustainable moves of the U.S. deficit and really what all this Mar-A-Lago Accord concept has to in store, and what would a revaluation of the U.S. gold supply and reserve mean for the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve and the Treasury. So there's a lot in this conversation that we cover with Brent. A great person to have on and try to hash all this out. He's been writing quite extensively about the deficits and rising yields. So special thank you to Caliber Mining. They had a big week. Visa Silver and also Integra Resources for their continued support of the podcast here on Mining Stock Daily. And as always, if you wouldn't mind, hit that like, subscribe, and share on your podcast network or on the YouTube page, where you can also see the video of this conversation. All right, everybody, let's jump into this wonderful conversation. It is very insightful with Mr. Brent Johnson. Be well. All right, everybody, welcome into Mining Stock Daily on this Friday as we wrap up our week. And this is going to be a very big, important conversation. Lots of moving parts here because I've had to do a huge deep dive in this concept. Some of the big analysts in macro minds are titling the Mar-A-Lago Accord. It's a concept in nature. There's a lot of moving parts. Gold plays an important role in this fixture as we continue to talk about Fort Knox, potential audit, and do we take that gold underneath on the books and revalue it? So, why not bring in Brent Johnson, one of my favorite Nebraskans, by the way, of Santiago Capital, to hash this all out. Hey, bud.
Good. I'm good, man. How are you?
I'm doing really well. I did not expect to have to do a deep dive in all of this stuff this week. It kind of caught me off guard over the weekend, listening to a Jim Bianco interview on another podcast. And then, but honestly, putting some of these pieces together. But Brent, let's talk about it. It's a concept. It's gaining traction on restructuring U.S. debt, decreasing the value of the dollar, and also realigning trade. And that's just on the cover of this whole thing. All right. So from your seat, talk about what this all means, what we should be taking away, and really how you are kind of studying this all.
Sure. Well, I think the best way to start off on this whole topic is to kind of step back for a minute and just understand kind of what's happening from a bigger picture perspective, and then we'll drill down into, the Mar-A-Lago Accord or, the debt revaluation or the U.S. dollar revaluation. But, really, and this, of course, I'm going to say something that is incredibly obvious, but I think it's important to set the stage, and that is, Trump getting back into the White House. It's somewhat of a revolution, not in terms of a political revolution, although it is somewhat of that as well. But it is a wholesale change in the way the United States has conducted business for the last 40 or 50 years, including the last time Trump was president. So I don't think we can just single out one thing and say, hey, this is what's happening here. I think it's all part of one unified singular plan. And I don't want to come across as if this is some 3D chess move by Trump. I think it's the exact opposite of a 3D chess move. Like a 3D chess move, is kind of one of these sneaky little things that somebody thinks you're going one way and then you're actually going the other. Trump is about as transparent as he can possibly be without giving away everything. I mean, he has basically come in. Well, he said it on the campaign trail, and he said it from day one on the campaign trail, was that when I get back in office, we are going to do things differently, and we're going to put America first. And he didn't mean that just with regards to social policy or just with regards to monetary policy or just with regards to trade or just with regards to the military. He meant it with everything. And so I think in the past, where we have had one group doing monetary policy and another group doing economic policy and another group doing domestic policy and another group working on trade policy and another group working on military strategy and geopolitical alignment, where I think they have been somewhat occasionally coordinated in the past, now they are being massively coordinated into one defining strategy, which is America First. That's probably the best way to explain it. And that is very different than what has historically happened. And I've actually been writing about this quite a bit we started a Substack channel about a month ago. And part of the reason that we started it was because that's a way for me to kind of get some of these thoughts that I have out as a way to get in more kind of short form, hey, this is what's happening here, this is what's happening here, as opposed to some of our longer form research pieces on big, broader topics. But I think the best way to understand what is happening now and why it is so revolutionary, you have to understand how the system has been run for the last 60, 70, 80 years. And I know I'm rambling on for a long time here, but I really think that this is critical. And the interesting thing for me that's going on right now is what's the right way to say this? It's a real world happening of everything I studied in grad school. So what I mean by that is, when I went to grad school, I not only studied business, I went to an international business school. And as part of that international business, they didn't just teach us what goes on in the U.S. They taught us the way, people around the world do business, and they taught us how the world interacts with each other from a rules-based order. And you may have heard this rules-based order from time to time, either in interviews that people give or when, people write about it. It's kind of an officially used language to explain the structure that was set up to kind of rule and govern the world post-World War II. And in that system, there was the United States, there was the United States allies, there was the World Bank, there was the IMF, there was the United Nations, and there was there was the WTO, and some of these started at the beginning, and some of them were developed over time. But long story short, there was an official network of institutions that did business in a certain way in order to make sure that nothing too crazy happened and that they could calm things down when they got a little overheated and that they could negotiate things kind of behind the scenes so it didn't cause a big economic crisis or a political crisis or a war. And Trump has kind of come in and said, and I should back up and say, that system that was set up, it was set up as kind of an altruistic way to benefit the whole world, push the world forward, not have wars happening all the time, and to increase trade amongst the world. And those things did happen. And there is certainly that point of view. But the other side of the coin is that it kind of masked the fact that the United States was kind of the global police or the global hegemon or the global bully, however you want to describe that. It was a way to kind of talk nice without having the U.S. just coming out and saying point blank, we're the toughest guy on the block, this is the way things are going to be. Trump coming in is kind of taking that second modus operandi. He is saying, listen, we're not going to make any excuses anymore that we're doing this for the greater good. We're not going to enter into these multilateral trade deals that are good for the whole world, but might not necessarily be good for the United States. We are no longer going to join treaties that put another country or another continent ahead of the United States, and we are going to put America first. And it sounds really simple, and it is, but it's also incredibly complex because it's tearing apart these institutions that have existed for literally decades. So I think it's crucial to understand that. So I know that was kind of a big, long, rambling introduction, but I think it's really important to have that foundational understanding of what actually is happening.
Yeah. That's wonderful, and we got to start kind of breaking this apart here, and really what a new order looks like. And if you're talking about restructuring the monetary system that is the U.S. dollar, we've gone back and forth for the last couple of years here, Brent, talking about the quote-unquote hyperbole of de-dollarization. And we've had multiple conversations. You've been outspoken about your theories on the whole thing. But I think it's important to note, maybe ask the question, because of everything on the table here, from Stephen Mirren and his Hudson Bay report from back in November, what you're hearing from Posnar, in this idea of reorganizing world trade, that the U.S. is not going to be, at least under Trump, is not going to be the global police without getting some sort of compensation back. And by doing that, restructuring U.S. debt to potential long-term bonds without any premium to it, and also revaluing the U.S. dollar, or at least bringing that down so it makes U.S. exports, more achievable for the U.S. That's American First policy. Are we looking at not necessarily a de-dollarization, but a new monetary system with the likes of a Bretton Woods, a Plaza Accord in 1971? Is that what we're seeing, the first couple innings of this?
Well, potentially. And listen, this is a big deal. And I'm not going to sit here and say this isn't a big deal. It's actually a very big deal. I don't think we're there yet. I'm not expecting to wake up next week, next month, or even next year and have this grand announcement that this new structure has been put in place. I'm not going to say that can't happen, but that's not my base case. But to your point, is it the early innings of this? Yes, I absolutely think it is the early innings of it. And one of the points that I have tried to make over the last couple of years, and part of the reason I've pounded this table on it so hard, is because I think it's so important. Typically, people who grow up in America, like you or me, right? Typical, United States, even, Midwestern, or even, the Californians and the New Yorkers who typically have historically had more exposure to international markets and, world affairs, grew up thinking in one currency. And so we don't necessarily think currencies are a big deal, because all we have ever known is the dollar. But if you speak to somebody from Europe or Africa or Asia, they all think in 2 or 3 different currencies. They think in their local currencies, they think in the US dollar, and perhaps they think in 1 or 2 others that they interact with on a regular basis. And that is a huge deal. It's hard to get across how big of a deal it is. Not only that, but if you look back at every financial crisis of the last 50 or 60 years, almost every one of them has an element of causation, the cause being one currency either rising or falling dramatically versus another currency. So that's why this is important. Okay, so now let's bring this back to your point. Are we seeing the early innings of a change? The point I have tried to make is not that the system cannot change. The system can absolutely change. But the system cannot change from what we have now to something new without the U.S. being involved in it. So in other words, the rest of the world cannot just get together and say, hey, we're no longer going to use the dollar, we're going to de-dollarize, we're going to go do our own thing, and there won't be any pain involved for them, and it would be great and pain involved for the United States. The system is not set up that way, and the likelihood of that happening is about as low as I can. Nothing is ever 100%, but that or 0%, but that's about as low as I can possibly think of a probability. But the system could change with great chaos, or it could change as the result of some grand bargain that the United States and the rest of the world work out together. But under either of those circumstances, there is going to be volatility and probably some economic pain involved. and very possibly great economic pain involved. And so and I think we are perhaps entering the early innings of something like that. I do think the system can change. I don't think it can happen without great volatility. And I don't think Trump is the type of person to sit back and let that pain hit the United States without also hitting the rest of the world. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is something. Listen, I think the idea is big and grand because the U.S. debt, it's an urgent problem, and you've written about this.
Yep.
It is a very serious problem that needs to be answered. But at the same time, if something like this Mar-A-Lago Accord does have legs, it's not something you, like you said, can be launched next week or next year. There will be consequences. There will be ramifications. Now, if you have a plan in front of you that you're willing to maybe see through, and you put out your models and you see, the rising tides or the volatility that would be the reaction to such a move, and because you're not beholden to a specific timeline, although it is somewhat urgent, you have the ability to kind of tweak what is delivered to try to mitigate whatever the consequences potentially could be. And those consequences will be political, no doubt. But it does seem when you have the likes of, and I'm with you, I think, Trump is a gunslinger. I think he says things that he has no idea what he's really coming out of his mouth, and somehow the people behind him that are, very good at what they do have the foresight and the experience to know what needs to happen, can potentially take this and fit it into whatever model or concept this might be, including a sovereign wealth fund. I think that's a great example of somehow this fitting into this thing. But I think because the U.S. has to be a part of it, because of this reserve currency status, we have time to try to tweak things to try to mitigate the severe consequences that would happen if we were forced to do it immediately. Does that make sense?
Yes, and I think that is what is happening here. So it's funny because there's two different schools of thought, right? And without going too far down the rabbit hole of what Austrian economics is and what the modern monetary theorists believe, there's two different schools of thought on how to handle this. But regardless of which school you are in, the fact is that there is a perception that the U.S. is at a point where it needs to make a change or face dire consequences, right? And part of that has to do with the budget, continuing to run budget deficits. It has to do with running trade deficits. It has to do with the way we treat the rest of the world. So it's all part of this grand unified theory. But there does seem to be this groundswell that this is the time, and Trump ran on, making this change. And he has run on that, listen, we can make this change and we can usher in a golden age for the United States. It doesn't necessarily have to mean death and destruction and Armageddon, right? But I don't think that he can do that without causing pain elsewhere. So here's what I mean by that. Some of the stuff he says makes sense, and some of the other stuff he says makes sense, but not if you do them together. So he contradicts himself often. So as an example, he will say, we want to get the US dollar lower. That will help us in trade, but he also wants to fight inflation. That's it's not that those are impossible to coexist, but they're somewhat contradictory. The other thing is that he will say is that we want to get back to making things in America. We don't want to import everything. We don't want to just be a service-based economy. We want to manufacture things in the United States. We want to bring jobs back to the United States. We want to increase wages in the United States. And as a result, we're going to put these tariffs on, and we are no longer going to run these huge trade deficits with the rest of the world. Okay, that's fine as well. But if you're going to do that, then that means you are going to be exporting fewer dollars to the rest of the world. Because the way that we typically export dollars to the rest of the world is we buy their stuff. That's the deal. They send us stuff, we send them dollars. right? And the cycle goes on and on. Trump is saying we no longer want to do that anymore. So here's the thing. If you don't export those dollars to the rest of the world, then there's not going to be as many dollars out there to service all the U.S. dollar debt and obligations that exist outside the United States. So that tends to push up the price of the dollar. So again, we've got a contradiction. He wants to export fewer dollars, but he wants the dollar to fall. That's, it's not that nothing's ever impossible, but that's pretty close. The other thing is that if we're not going to export the U.S. dollar to the rest of the world, and there's not enough dollars for them to go around to operate efficiently, then they are going to be forced to find an alternative to the dollar. But he has also, when I say he, I mean Trump. Trump has also said the BRICS are not going to develop their own currency. These countries are not going to stop using the U.S. dollar. If they stop using the U.S. dollar, they are going to be exposed to sanctions in the United States. Mm-hmm. So again, he doesn't want to give them the dollars to operate, but he also doesn't want them to use anything other than the dollar, right? And so you've got these big contradictions. And so and those contradictions, if left to play out, typically will cause economic chaos, for lack of a better way of saying. So these are not simple things. These are, and here's the other thing that I should point out, is we're talking about all of these things that these governments can get together and coordinate and do, and everything's just going to work great. Well, when is the last time you saw a government program work efficiently the way it was supposed to? Right? I think sometimes we assume that these politicians, both in the United States and around the world, have these superpowers that they can just snap their finger and something's going to be a certain way and everything's going to work out. Listen, they're powerful. They can mandate certain things and they can institute certain things. But there's no guarantee that some of this doesn't get blown up in the process, right? And so even if the intentions are good and the coordination is good and everybody's in agreement how to do it, doesn't necessarily mean it's going to work out favorably. So, I know I keep saying how big of a problem this is, but it is. It's a really big problem. It is really interesting to see the different ways they're trying to solve it. And perhaps this is, we could kind of get into the Mar-A-Lago Accord here. But these are the types of issues that are being dealt with. There's a lot of contradictions. There's a lot of desires. There's not a lot of hard answers right now.
And I think with this Mar-a-Lago Accord concept is something that, this is actually the first structural idea that I've read on how to deal with the debt. Yes. As thorough as it is.
Yep.
I mean, I've never read anything like it that actually, it's so crazy it might work. Right?
Yeah. Well,
now, is it going to bring down $36 trillion in debt right away? Hell no. But what if it brought down 2 or 3 trillion? At least you're on the right path.
Well, and so here's what you're absolutely right, but here's where we run into another contradiction. The current design of the monetary system is one where money gets loaned into existence. Mm-hmm. And it's loaned into existence with interest, which means there is never enough money to pay off all the debt. The system is designed in a way that there is never enough money to pay off all the debt. And as a result, the system has to grow. If it doesn't grow, then it contracts. And that's a credit contraction. And typically, credit contractions are not fun for business people and politicians because, it creates pain and chaos. So how do we, and because the whole world runs on U.S. dollars, how do we get the debt down and not export enough dollars, but not have that credit contraction and not have that financial pain? One of the things that they have talked about doing is not necessarily decreasing the debt in this specific move, but restructuring the debt as a first step. And I think this is what you were referring to with part of the Mar-a-Lago Accord and what you were saying with the adding a premium, not adding a premium onto it. So maybe I'll just discuss this a little bit here. One of the ideas But I think it was Jim Bianco who first coined this phrase, the Mar-A-Lago Accord. But
I think you're right.
Or this specific version. I think I had heard, like I think last fall they were talking about a Mar-A-Lago Accord, but most recently, what we're going to talk about now, I think Jim is the first one to kind of put it on paper, so to speak, even though conversations may have been going on. So what essentially is he is saying is, and this kind of goes back to my point of the one unified theory. So, and I'm going to take a step back, but we're going to get to this Mar-a-Lago Accord. But again, I need to set this up. So, and I'll give you some concrete examples. So as an example of how Trump is consolidating policies across different silos, government silos, or different government initiatives, he is, and putting them all as one is, let's use the tariffs on Canada and Mexico just as an example. Those are not strictly about the trade imbalance. They do involve the trade imbalance, but they're not strictly about the trade imbalance. They are also about securing America's borders. Now, regardless of whether you think the borders should be more secure or not, Trump wants them more secure. And the people that voted for him, that was a main thing, one of the main things that they voted for. So to think that he is not going to secure those borders is a little bit silly, a little bit naive. But rather than just saying to Canada and Mexico, we want you to secure these borders, and having discussions back and forth for a year about how they're going to do it, he basically said, get the borders secure on your side, or we're going to put tariffs on you. That's the consequence. Yeah. So again, there's no more, we're going to take it to the United Nations. There's no more, we're going to have a policy committee meeting at the World Trade Organization. This is Trump just saying, this is in America's best interest. I don't care what the WTO says. I don't care what the United Nations says. This is what we're doing. And so that is an example of national security and economic policy and trade all being wrapped into one. Along the same lines is Trump is saying, we helped build the Panama Canal. It's vital to the United States' national interests. We never should have given it away when we did. We're getting charged too much to send our ships through there. We are going to re-exert our influence over the Panama Canal. And now again, that's and he has said, listen, if this doesn't happen, there's going to be explosive consequences. Now, you can take that however you want, right? But it's basically an unveiled threat. Now, that's not the way things have been done for the last 50 or 60 years. That's him putting the United States interests first, going around the United Nations, forgetting about the WTO or forgetting about whatever State Department, agreement was there previously. He sent Marco Rubio down there, and Marco met with the Panamanian president. He met with the president of El Salvador. He met with the president of Guatemala. They already sent representatives to Venezuela. So basically, again, you can't forget the energy component of Venezuela, right? Mm-hmm. And so again, he's doing it all. Everybody's working towards the same goal, putting American interest first, unashamedly. Okay. So now let's bring this to the Mar-a-Lago Accord. Part of the idea that his, cabinet or his advisors, however you want to term them, is, and I think Scott Bessent is the Treasury Secretary. I believe he's the first one that actually vocalized this. He said, we are looking at ways to monetize the asset side of the Fed balance sheet rather than just always focusing on the liabilities. If we actually properly valued the assets, the balance sheet doesn't look so bad because the United States has great assets. A lot of truth to that, right? And so this is where, I think the idea of potentially revaluing gold, which I think we'll get to that in a minute. But the other idea is that they could they could monetize the U.S. military. And that sounds silly, but again, going back to World War II, part of the rules-based order was that the United States would, even though not officially say we are the world police, they would monitor the sea lanes. They would provide security to certain allies. They would provide the majority of the funding and the defense capabilities for treaties like NATO and be the protector of, certain, whether it was Japan, whether it was Taiwan. Much of Europe falls under the United States defense umbrella, whether they like it or not. And so, but we've always just kind of done that. And the benefit was we got this quote unquote soft power out of it. We got them to vote with us on certain initiatives. They agreed with us when new treaties were designed. And so, but it was always kind of an implicit arrangement, right?
Well,
it was never written in hard. Yeah.
Sorry,
yeah.
can I bust in? But except that it also established the U.S. dollar as a reserve currency. Because
No, absolutely.
Right, and it allowed,
Absolutely.
and it kind of it convinced other sovereign countries to buy U.S. treasuries. So
Absolutely. So as part of that, I'm glad you brought this up because this is important to understand.
Yeah.
Part of this implicit guarantee or providing of defense, probably the best example of this, where it wasn't in writing and there's no document that you can go to and find the bullet points that spell this out, was the arrangement between Saudi Arabia and the United States in the early 1970s. When Saudi Arabia, when all the oil reserves were developed, and they became the number one supplier of energy to the United States and to the rest of the world, the United States struck this kind of unofficial agreement that said, you price your oil in dollars. With the dollars that you receive for selling your oil to the world, you buy U.S. treasuries. And in exchange for you buying U.S. treasuries, we will provide your family defense against any usurpers, so you guys will remain on the throne. But not only that, we will help you develop your current desert kingdom into a modern marvel. And that is largely what has happened. I don't have the number right in front of me, but the wealth per citizen in Saudi Arabia from 1975 to now is, basically up and to the right. They have ultra-modern highways, they have ultra-modern malls and airports, and they have telecommunications. And, again, this is a dramatic change from where they were 50, 60 years ago. And that was all done partly as a result of this agreement. So that is it. And again, and because of the U.S., not only that, but because of the unspoken defense agreement, it made their country more stable, right? And so other countries were more willing to invest in it, trade with them. And then as a result of that dollar being used, that kind of solidified the dollar as a global reserve currency because the whole world needed energy and they needed dollars to buy the energy. Okay, so let's bring this to the... Now we're finally here, right?
I know. We warned everybody this was a big conversation.
Well, and it's impossible to just go right to the conversation.
Right.
With it, or you can, but then you miss the context.
Right.
So with all of that as the context, now the idea is that rather than just having these unspoken alliances and, these implicit, benefits, for us using our military, the idea is, what? We'll protect you. We'll put you under our defense umbrella, but it's going to cost you. And, treasuries are no longer just capital market investments that you make. Treasuries are now tribute, right?
That's a great way to put it. That's a great way to put it.
Yeah. And so you will buy our treasuries, and as a result, you will be under our defense umbrella. That's the way they monetize the asset side or that's one of the ways they monetize the asset side of the balance sheet. The other thing they say is, all that debt that's currently outstanding, and that is, these T-bills that we issued at 1% or 4% or 3% or 5%, whatever the number is, you know what? Those are all now getting converted to 100-year bonds that pay, 3% or whatever the number is. Right?
I've heard nothing.
Or nothing, right? But this is the thing. It's like and here, the best example. How old are you? When were you born?
82.
Oh God, you're a kid. 82?
82.
Oh man, you're a kid. So I was born in 72. So I'm a lot older than you. But one of the most impactful, long-running influences on my life are the Star Wars movies, right?
Of
course. They're iconic. And there's that scene in The Empire Strikes Back where, Lando Calrissian says to Darth Vader, hey, this wasn't part of the deal. And Darth Vader says, you know what? I'm altering the deal. And just, pray I don't alter it any further. And that's kind of how I've envisioned this Mar-A-Lago Accord where, the outstanding treasury bonds get converted to 100-year bonds. That wasn't the deal. I bought T-bills paying 4%, 5%, because I wanted the liquidity. I didn't want to take any duration risk. I didn't want to have my money tied up for a long time. But now, you know what? Darth Vader's changing the rules. It's now a 100-year bond. And if you don't take it, okay. But don't come looking to us when things go south, right?
Yeah.
And by the way, you are no longer given most favored nation status in trade deals and da-da-da-da-da-da. And now I think many people would say, well, that's not the way things should be. That's not exactly, the white shining city on a hill that Reagan envisioned. And listen, I agree with you, but I try to focus on reality, right? And this is the current reality. The reality has changed. And I think this is kind of a brave new world that we're entering. One that scares me a little bit, one that I don't necessarily like, but it's coming whether I like it or not, right?
I've actually, there's been moments where I've been, studying this stuff, a couple hours here throughout the week, and I've actually had to get up off my desk, Brent, and go for just a quick walk just to get my heart rate down, because there's so much unknown, and it is scary, for lack of better words, but it's actually, again, I'll go back to say, like, when it comes to managing the debt of the U.S. in the U.S. deficit, there's nothing that's been present in front of me before that actually looks like a plan. Now, and that's kind of like where I'm at. It's huge, and there's a lot to understand through all this, and especially if you're not active in markets or finance. If you're like Gus, that just was more worried about shooting pheasants and branding cattle growing up, this is stuff that you wouldn't be paying attention to. But it is really important. I do want to go back and talk about this use of tariffs as like a coercive tool to kind of move this concept forward, and really focus on hypothetically what this means for our biggest trading partner in China. And obviously, there's no doubt we are in this Cold War type of economic warfare with China. Yet things continue to move fairly functionally okay on the surface of things, but underneath it, things are getting really ugly. China holds like almost $1 billion of U.S. Treasury debt. Like over $800 billion, I think, is last I saw. Now, with the tensions between the two of us, and without something kind of being, putting to rest between now and whenever something like this accord would be put in place, I don't see how the Chinese would say, yes, we'll take this $800 billion and move it all to century bonds without any premium. And yes, we will continue to be active trading partners with the U.S. And yes, we will actively help, support the U.S. military as the police of the world, despite us really increasing our own military spending for the last 20 years. That's not where they're going. That's not what they want to do.
Well, I think this is where the conundrum starts again, right? You've got these contradictions. On the one hand, Trump says, my good friend Xi has done a great job of managing the relationship with the United States. He signed some great trade deals. I don't blame him. I would have done the same thing. But I blame our leaders, right? But on the other hand, he's got to convince Xi to do something that Xi doesn't want to do. And I don't think, again, never say never, but I don't think Trump, in order to make America great again, also wants to see China continue to rise and nip at its heels, so to speak, right? Mm-hmm. So this is a long way of saying I think it's going to come to a head. There's that book that was written 2 or 3 years ago. I think it was called The Thucydides Trap, which, and it goes back to ancient Greece, is, when you have one power and then another rising power, is it possible that those two powers will not eventually go to war. And, I am of the belief that unfortunately that's where I think we're headed. And this is not what I want. I will happily admit I was wrong if I am wrong, but I just think that's probably where this is eventually heading. Because I don't think that putting America first by Trump and putting China first by Xi is a doable thing in a connected world. What we could potentially have is regionalization. So go from a globalized world to go to a more regionalized world. I think that is likely. And, China will kind of shore up different countries on its side, and the United States will shore up countries on its side. And so we'll have rise of these other poles of interest. I don't think those poles will be anywhere near as powerful as the United States, but it doesn't mean that they won't exist. But again, to your point, is China going to accept 100-year century bonds? Probably not. But again, I don't think the United States is necessarily going to ask them permission, right? Trump doesn't seem to be the type to ask permission. He just does it and deals with the consequences. And should that happen, would it be bad for the United States if China did not go along with the deal? Yeah, probably so. But it wouldn't be great for China either, right? And I think that's what a lot of... I think this... Let me make this point before I forget, because I think this is absolutely critical. So first of all, I am not someone who loves tariffs. I'm at heart, I'm a free market guy. But again, I'm also a realist. The rest of the world puts all kinds of tariffs on the United States. The idea that the United States should not put any tariffs back, to me, is a little bit hypocritical. And while I don't think they're necessarily going to work perfectly the way that Trump thinks they are, I don't think that they're going to fail miserably the way a lot of people think they will. And I think a lot of people will hear the word tariff and automatically assume that that means a disaster for the United States and not so many problems for the rest of the world. And I think that's wrong. I think the rest of the world gets impacted just as much and probably more than the United States if these tariffs go forward. It doesn't mean there won't be pain here. It doesn't mean it won't hurt. Another reference from the 80s that I've used a lot over the last year is the Hagler versus Hearns fight. Have you ever seen that?
No.
Okay, so back in the 80s, there was Marvin Hagler and Thomas Hearns were the two top boxers. And they had this match, and if you can look it up on YouTube. It's an incredible fight. And both of those fighters going in, they know they're going to get hit. Nobody goes into this fight thinking they're not going to get hit. But in the first round, Hearns hits Hagler really hard and opens up this big cut above his eye, and there's blood all over his face. And they almost had to stop the fight. But somehow, his corner got the bleeding stopped, and they went back out there. And in the third round, Hagler knocks out Hearns. So the analogy I'm using is I'm not saying the U.S. won't get hit. I'm not saying the U.S. won't get hurt. And I'm not saying the U.S. won't bleed. We probably will. But the U.S. also has the ability to throw knockout blows that the rest of the world doesn't. And, when you're in a fight, it's not an absolute game. It's a relative game. It's like match play in golf. You just got to beat the other guy. And so I think that's kind of the world we're entering.
Do you, and I'm glad you said that, because actually I was trying to figure out how to put this in really good words. But I was thinking about, okay, how do you isolate China through something like this? And the knockout punch would be Russia. And I'm starting to wonder if, as ugly and as, as many people hate it, but the Trump administration trying to work with Russia to end the war in Ukraine, if that is another piece of the chessboard to bringing Russia into a better trade negotiation with the United States and away from China. If you break Russia away from China, China's in a heap load of serious trouble.
Yeah, absolutely. And the interesting thing about all this, and this is not a prediction, it's just an observation that I will point out for people that don't know. The United States has never gone to war with Russia. There's been a number of proxy wars. There's been a number of little skirmishes here and there in separate theaters. But Russia's never attacked the United States, and the United States has never attacked Russia. And in fact, in the major world wars, Russia and the United States were always allies. So there's more history of the United States and Russia cooperating than Russia and China cooperating. Now, again, I'm not predicting that. I don't know what's going to happen. I'm just saying, historically speaking, that hasn't, your point from a historical perspective is a good one.
Yeah. I've been reading a lot on kind of the years and months leading up to World War I and been finding out, obviously the Scheifelen plan was in place for many years leading to August of 1914, but in the 10, 20 years leading up to World War I, there was all these proxy wars happening between the countries in other continents. And even like the players involved in World War I, like if you read about their behavior and their demeanor, it's like you could literally just replace that person with a current person who's in office in any country, and it's like, oh, this is playing out just like history rhymes is supposed to, right? It's really fascinating.
It is really fascinating. The other part we haven't even really talked about yet is going back to monetizing the balance sheet is the gold revaluation story, right?
Yes.
Now, the way this would work, there's a couple ways this could work. One is the idea that the U.S. would monetize the gold on its balance sheet. So the U.S. owns is it 8,300 or 8,500 tons? I always forget the exact number, but I should also say this is also part of the reason over the last couple of years when people have told me that the rest of the world will use gold to defeat the United States or go against the United States, part of my answer has always been, well, how can they do that when the U.S. has more gold than anybody, right? It's not like we don't have that asset. We do have that asset. And, over the last couple of years, as a lot of gold was flowing eastward towards China, it was leaving London, it was leaving Switzerland. There wasn't as many people in the United States buying it, and you could see these gold imports into Asia. And the idea was that Asia is going to end up with all the gold, and the United States is going to be left out in the cold, so to speak. Well, over the last couple of months, where's all the gold been flowing? Right, it's been flowing to the United States, and part of the idea is, they want to have part of it has to do with the tariffs. Those who own gold there and they want to use it in the United States, they want to get it into the United States before there's a tariff. There's some arbitrage that has taken place historically that works when there's no tariffs, but it doesn't work when there are tariffs. And then perhaps also just wanting to get it into the most favored nation, where you think the capital is going to be treated best. Europe's got a war on its doorstep if things aren't calmed down with Russia. But then the other idea is that the gold the United States already has on its balance sheet could be revalued. And the way that works is, to me, this is a fascinating thing. You might have seen I put out I don't know, 2 or 3 times a year, I put out this analysis that shows what the price of gold would have to be based on a country's reserves in order to back either their monetary base, the M2 or the M3, whatever it is. And, because the U.S. has 8,500 tons worth of gold, and by the way, I actually think they have a lot more than that, but that's the official number. If they were to revalue gold on their balance sheet right now to $3,000 or $2,900, where whatever it's at today, rather than the 42 or 45 that they carried at, that would create $800 billion worth of cash in the Treasury's account that the Treasury could then use to either pay down the debt or invest in a sovereign wealth fund or whatever it is, right? And that is true. There is that functionality that can work. The key for me is that this is where we get back into. It's really fascinating. This is where we get back into where things could work really well or they could totally go awry because of the contradictions. So again, we've said Trump wants to get the dollar lower, but he also wants to get inflation lower, right? Okay, so if you revalue gold on your balance sheet, you're basically devaluing the dollar versus gold. That in itself is probably inflationary, if for no other reason than the Treasury now has $800 billion in their account that they can spend out into the economy. Now there's 800 billion more money floating around, right?
Right.
But there's nothing that says that they would just revalue it to 3,000. They could revalue it to 10,000 or 20,000. And if they did that, they would massively be able to pay off the debt or pay down the debt. But then you're massively devaluing the dollar versus gold as well. Now that kind of goes counter to the Fed's mandate of no inflation. Now the Fed is it's not officially a U.S. government agency. They have independence up to a point, and they can act independently of what the Treasury wants them to do. So, in other words, they wouldn't necessarily have to accept that revaluation and put that money in the TGA's account. I think they probably would, but they don't necessarily have to do it, and they wouldn't have to do it right away. They could certainly cause some problems for a couple of days or a couple of weeks. Or maybe they say, okay, yeah, we'll put that money into the TGA account, but we're also going to raise interest rates to 7% to offset this. Because remember, here again, the Fed loves having their independence. Nobody likes having their power taken away from them. And, the inflation that was suffered in 2021 and 2022 coming out of COVID was probably the worst, quote unquote, crisis for the Fed in its history, right? Or at least in the last 50 or 60 years, or at least since the 1970s, right? And they had the whole inflation is transitory that kind of went against them. Well, Jerome Powell does not want to be remembered as Arthur Burns, who is the last Treasury Secretary or the last Fed Secretary to oversee, really high inflation in the United States. Powell has now spent the last year or two trying to get inflation under control. He has started to get it under control. And now all of a sudden he has to worry about Trump putting, $2 or $3 trillion into the Treasury account and ruining all the work he has done. What's that going to do to Powell's legacy, right? And so, and for people who are saying that the Fed would never go against the Treasury, well, there's many historical precedents where they have gone against what the Treasury wanted them to do. I did a whole video on it about a week ago. So there's lots of precedent where the Fed has gone against the Treasury. Now, ultimately, I don't think central banks are independent. I don't think the Fed is either. If the government really wanted something done, they could pass some laws and make changes to get the Fed to play along. But in this political climate, where anything Trump does is automatically said, no, we don't want to do that. Do you think the Democrats are automatically going to go along with devaluing the dollar by 50% or 100% or whatever it is? Again, I think it could probably get done, but it's not easy to do, at least not easy politically to do. So there's a lot of interesting things that can be done, but even though they can be done, doesn't mean that they can be done without problems, without volatility, without unexpected outcomes along the way. But it is a really interesting idea, this whole Mar-A-Lago Accord, of how they could kind of reset America's finances in a way that puts them on a more sustainable path.
Yeah. One of the things you had written about but didn't actually mention in that dialogue there, Brent, was the implications on the gold market itself.
Oh, yeah.
And if they were to revalue it at $2,900, I mean, why even $2,900? They could do it to $5,000 if they really wanted to.
Right.
But that would have just incredible consequences just on the gold market itself, including the derivatives market. It would be dysfunctional. So,
again, absolutely. And these are big markets, right? These aren't small markets. And so I suppose with the COMEX and, with GLD and, the way you read the prospectus, they could close people, they do it they revalue it over the weekend. And so you come in Monday morning and all your contracts are closed out at, whatever the close of business was on Friday, and you just get cash instead of, the new price. Well, that works on the COMEX and perhaps on, some other, exchange dealers. But what about all these OTC derivatives all over the world that are just between different firms? How do those get solved? And again, maybe they do get solved. I don't know for sure. Maybe everybody accepts it. Seems unlikely to me that everybody would just finally be, they finally get the payoff that they've wanted, and now they get closed out of, with the close of business on Friday. And so then what does that do for the belief in markets going forward from there? Do people still trust the markets? Do they think that they can still put on these bets, and if they get it right and it pays off, that they don't just get closed out for cash for no profit? So there's a number. This isn't the point is this is not a small idea. Like, money permeates all of society. The whole world kind of runs on money. You start playing around with the money, a lot of unexpected things can happen, and they don't necessarily go the way that you think that they will.
With that said, Brent, and like I said, spent a number of hours this week reading all this stuff, trying to brief myself, put in my own thoughts, my own questions, my own analysis, like all those things. In the back of my head, it's like, okay, in the long run, if something like this, a Mar-A-Lago Accord, does come into fruition, if there's all these moving parts, the world trade order changes, the monetary system itself changes, there's going to be consequences. What do you do with your capital? I cannot find anywhere else other than precious metals that would be remotely even as safe. I just don't know. I don't know why go into equities? Why go into the bond market if the yields are just going to continue to rise? I just don't see anywhere else to go until things stabilize.
Well, I think you definitely own precious metals. So I think, and here's the thing is, let's say that this Mar-a-Lago Accord doesn't happen. Let's say that they come out and say, we're not revaluing gold. It wouldn't surprise me at all if gold pulls back a couple $100, $500. Yeah. Wouldn't shock me at all. But listen, gold is going to end up, I've said for years, gold is going to end up at $5,000 and probably a lot higher than that. It's the one thing that can't be inflated away and can't get destroyed in a deflationary storm. So it should be the cornerstone of everybody's portfolio. So everybody should own gold. And I stand by that. But, I don't know for sure that it's rocketing to go to $5,000 right from here. And it wouldn't surprise me at all, if we get a pullback here. The other thing is I think you got to have some cash or at least short-term liquidity that you can use because all of this stuff, you cannot go from a way of doing business for 50 years to doing it completely different and fiddling with things like the monetary system itself, global trade agreements, global geopolitical agreements. You can't go from one to the other and not expect there to be some volatility and unintended consequences. So you got to have some cash in order to potentially protect yourself in a downturn and perhaps even take advantage of buying some stuff that's really cheap in that downturn. Now, as it relates to equities, I actually think that they are due for a correction. We're kind of seeing one of those now. I think the first 3 quarters of 2025 will be very similar to 2022. A lot of volatility, probably downside. But after we get past that, I'm not so sure that U.S. equities aren't a bad place to be. Because again, if Trump is going to continue to spend money, which I don't think he's going to not spend money, and he's able to create some savings and make the U.S. balance sheet look a little bit better, and he's able to mandate that certain goods get produced in the United States, or certain trade agreements lead to more capital coming here, or if he restructures the debt and as a result they don't have the high interest expense, I'm not sure that U.S. equities don't go higher in that scenario. So I think this is a long way of saying I don't think you should be closed off to anything. It doesn't mean you have to rush and put your whole portfolio into it. But I think, I certainly try to keep an open mind with what the possibilities are. And as we go through this, I just become more and more convinced that if I am going to place capital to work, I would rather place it to work in the United States than abroad. I don't see a big reason to go buy a bunch of emerging market assets when we look like we're going to have this uncertainty, and I would rather have the safe haven aspect of U.S. markets if things go bad, and I would rather have the high potential growth if some of Trump policies work.
All right, Brent. Big conversation. I'm so glad we could find the time to do it.
No, thank you for having me. It's fun to talk about. It's really a fascinating time, so I appreciate you inviting me on to talk about it.
It is, and it's like I kind of needed this therapy sessions for myself, like, given all of this stuff I've been reading. Yeah. It was a lot to swallow, and we'll see how things play out. Honestly, it wouldn't shock me if Trump says something or Besant says something, and then 3 weeks later, people find out that's another dot to the system.
Totally.
We'll see this. All right, Brent Johnson from Santiago Capital. You can go read and maybe inquire about his Substack, santiagocapital.substack.com. And Brent, thanks so much. I'll talk to you again soon.
All right, man. Thanks for having me. See ya.